When you think of judo specialists in MMA, names like Ronda Rousey or Kayla Harrison often come to mind. Yet before they stepped into the octagon, there was Karo Parisyan. Once a rising star in the MMA world, this Armenian judo prodigy seemed unstoppable and would grapple the brakes off of his opponents. But his career took an unexpected turn, leaving fans and analysts wondering what really happened to Karo Parisyan. So join us as we uncover the highs and lows of Karo Parisyan's journey. Karo Parisyan was training under both Gokor Chivichyan and the legendary LeBell by the age of 10. This combo made him a judo powerhouse in MMA. At his peak, Karo was a monster. Fans still talk about his fight with GSP, even though it wasn't a barn burner. It has aged incredibly well for Parisyan though. It was GSP's debut, and back then nobody really knew how good he would become. Karo gave GSP a run for his money, nearly catching him in submissions multiple times. Despite losing, Karo showed that he was no pushover. He was more than just a fighter. He was a unique spectacle. He brought a different judo style to MMA, blending traditional techniques with MMA's demands. One of his signature moves was the standing Kimura, which he executed flawlessly against GSP. Imagine flipping someone in the air half naked and slippery with sweat. That is skill. His MMA career record of 24-12-1 does not fully capture just how dominant he was. He beat Nick Diaz in a brutal battle and dominated Matt Serra. He earned a title shot against Matt Hughes, but a training injury sidelined him. After that, he was never quite the same. Yet he did remain a force, going 4-2 in his remaining UFC fights. Parisyan's grappling was something to behold. He could throw opponents around with techniques that seemed more at home in judo dojos than an MMA cage. Moves like the Uchimata, a hip throw that looks like art in motion, were risky, but Karo pulled them off with ease, rarely ending up in a bad position. His career, though, not crowned with any major title, left a lasting impression. He was a grappler through and through, comfortable in any position, whether in the clinch or on the ground. His fights were often like high-level grappling matches with occasional strikes. He wasn't stubborn about his style either. After losing to Diego Sanchez, he worked on his striking, showing improvements in his next fight. But years of fighting took their toll. Starting MMA at 14, Karo peaked early. By 24, he had already faced wear and tear. His post-UFC career saw ups and downs, fighting in smaller promotions and eventually Bellator. Though he showed flashes of his old self, his chin could not take the punishment anymore. The legendary Gokor Chivichyan and LeBell made Parisyan a master of the Hayastan Grappling System. This system is a deadly mix of judo, sambo, catch wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling, and freestyle wrestling. For over 13 years, Karo honed his craft at the Hayastan Academy. Before MMA, Karo was a judo prodigy. He had racked up 6 junior national titles and even competed in the Olympic judo trials ahead of the 2004 Athens Games. Judo was Karo's first love and the Olympics were his dream. But as fate would have it, the UFC came calling during the trials. Needing money, Karo accepted a fight, even though it meant giving up on his Olympic dream. After fighting Dave Strasser, an injury forced him to pull out of the trials. Karo made his UFC debut on September 23, 2003 against Dave Strasser, winning by Kimura. One of Karo's most memorable fights was against Diego Sanchez at UFC Fight Night 6, which he did lose via unanimous decision. This bout was named the 2006 Fight of the Year by Wrestling Observer Newsletter. One of the most memorable moments of the fight was when Sanchez knocked out Parisyan's dental veneer with a knee. Karo then went on to a winning streak, defeating Drew Fickett, Josh Berkman, and Rio Shonen by unanimous decision. However, at UFC Fight Night 13, Thiago Alves handed Karo a TKO loss with a knee from the clinch. At UFC 88, Karo was set to fight Yoshiyuki Yoshida, but a back injury forced him to a draw. After recovery, he faced Dong-Hyun Kim at UFC 94, winning a controversial split decision. But like many fighters, Karo had his struggles outside of the cage. Things came to a head when he tested positive for painkillers after his win over Dong-Hyun Kim at UFC 94, turning that victory into a no contest. Karo's troubles continued when he pulled out of a fight against against Dustin Hazelett at UFC 106. Dana White announced that Karo would never fight in the UFC again, citing a history of excuses. Karo's battle with painkiller addiction stemming from an old injury was revealed by his friend and trainer, Neil Melanson.
Karo Parisyan has a lot of problems, mentally, physically, emotionally, and he's got more problems than I could even talk about or care to talk about. He needs to get his personal life fixed and taken care of before he ever thinks about fighting again. The things that he's done, the last 3 fights have been so unprofessional. It's ridiculous and it's unforgivable. And, I like Karo Parisyan. Karo Parisyan has had his days when there were some great fights, and he hasn't been that Karo Parisyan for a long time. So he needs to get his life together.
Karo sought to continue his career with Strikeforce, but talks fell through. By September, Karo was back in the UFC, facing Dennis Hallman at UFC 123, but losing via TKO in the very first round, and has not competed in the UFC since.
These guys are smart guys, and Karo Parisyan's going to have to figure out the next chapter of his life.
Did you feel like he made enough progress before this fight, or were you kind of concerned as they got closer to fight time?
Listen, I would never put a guy, in harm's way. I'd never put a guy in the UFC that I thought, at least couldn't come in here and compete at this level. Karo came in tonight and proved that he can't compete at this level anymore.
So what is his status? What does his future look like in UFC?
Not good.
You're not saying that you're not saying he's gone yet.
Many fans have speculated that USADA might be the reason Parisyan hasn't made a return to the octagon. Now, while this might seem plausible given his past issues with banned substances, it is important to note that unlike some fighters, he never tested positive for steroids. His struggle was specifically with painkiller medication. Moreover, by the time that USADA came around, Karo was already well past his prime. In the MMA world, accusations of doping are always rampant. However, Karo has always been clear about his stance. He stated that the sport of MMA has always had fighters who looked like they were using steroids, but he has never doped in his entire life. His only issue with substances was pain medication, which he argues is a lack of performance rather than an enhancement. When the UFC partnered with the United States Anti-Doping Agency, USADA, it was a game changer. Karo understood why the UFC made this move, saying, "So many fighters have always blamed each other, accusing each other of steroids, and I think the UFC was just tired of it. Pride was one of the best shows in the world, but 80% of the fighters that came from Pride lost in the UFC. I don't believe it was a coincidence. They were all on juice."
If I think there is some guys, if there's a lot of guys that take steroid and performance enhancing drug, yes.
Yes.
And I have an idea of who. And I'm pretty, just from my gut feeling, 99.9% sure. I'm in a game, I'm talking to a lot of people in between fighters, we know who does who. There's only a few handful of people who does the whole team.
Yeah.
The word goes around, man. Especially when you're top elite fighter, the word goes around.
Now, Karo fought many fighters who were likely on performance-enhancing drugs, and he actually thought that the UFC partnering up with USADA was the best move for the business, as it would add accountability to the sport. This partnership with USADA aims to keep the sport clean. Some athletes claim ignorance about the substances they take, often citing products from vitamin shops. However, many know exactly what they are consuming. Karo himself faced many fighters on PEDs and managed to defeat them. He mentioned Ryan Ford as an example, expressing disbelief that Ford wasn't using performance enhancers. Karo wasn't worried about USADA testing because he had nothing to hide. Now, Karo's downfall in MMA can be traced back to his battle with painkiller addiction. It all started with a severe back and hamstring injury that left him in constant pain. To manage this pain, Karo turned to prescription painkillers. Initially, they helped him cope with the physical demands of training and fighting, but it wasn't long before he became dependent on them. The addiction began to affect his performance in the octagon. Karo wasn't the same explosive, dynamic fighter that fans had come to love. His training sessions were inconsistent and his performances started to suffer. The once promising fighter who had taken on the likes of Georges St-Pierre and Matt Serra was now struggling to maintain his place in the sport.
Like I said, for 3 years I was in the clouds.
Karo is popped positive for banned painkillers including hydrocodone, hydromorphone, and oxymorphone throughout his career. Now, even though he had a prescription for these medications due to his injuries, when he faced Dong-Hyun Kim at UFC 94, the Nevada State Athletic Commission suspended him for 9 months and ruled his victory a no contest. This was a major blow to his career and reputation.
He fined a total of 40% of $80,000, that his result be changed from a win to a no decision, that he be suspended for 9 months from the date of the event, and that he be required to provide us with a negative test result before he's allowed to engage in unarmed combat here in the state of Nevada in the future.
Even though he did return to the octagon multiple times, Karo's battle with addiction continued to haunt him. He pulled out of several fights at the last minute, citing personal reasons or injuries. But despite all of this, Karo still denies that he was ever addicted to painkillers. Instead, he emphasizes how he abused them, but wasn't addicted to them per se.
And so what have you done differently in this training camp to
Train, sparred, grapple, that's it, showed up in practice. And I'll be honest with you guys, I haven't kicked myself for this practice, for this fight, I really haven't, I swear to God, ask my friends. But, like I said, for 3 years, I was in the clouds.
So hopefully this can start some positive momentum for you.
Of course. It's a pipeline, we're building it. And eventually I'm climbing that ladder and I will get on top.
So what do you do to celebrate?
Don't ask. Nothing.